Cześć, hello, Vitam, and welcome to Pierogi to Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matulevich. On June 17th, 1952, a short article appeared on page 6 of the New York Times detailing an appalling crime that had occurred overseas. The casual reader, however, may barely have noticed it, having otherwise been enticed by the large advertisements for the latest Frigidaire air conditioners or the sales of Best & Company ladies' dresses that otherwise overwhelmed the page. Yet despite its brevity, this small article contained the rather enigmatic headline, "Countess is stabbed to death in London, was war heroine in Polish underground." Thus was reported in America the death of one Krystyna Skarbek, known by her anglicized name of Christine Granville, Polish-born spy whose exploits during the Second World War are recognized today as legendary, to say the least. Born Maria Krystyna Janina Skarbek in 1908 in Warszawa to a Polish count and German Jewish heiress, Krystyna came of age with the nation of Poland itself, as the country rose from the obliterated empires of Central and Eastern Europe after over a century of non-existence. Raised in a long and exalted family whose surname had been ennobled since the 11th century, she was brought up in an atmosphere of aristocratic privilege, yet with a spark and vigor that made her a strong woman that was not to be trifled with. The all too brief interwar peace was shattered by the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany, and Poland, once again under a state of foreign occupation, Krystyna joined the secret intelligence services of the British Empire. With this action, a legend was born. Dashing exploits full of intrigue and death defiance, Christine achieved remarkable actions that ranged from breaking free resistance fighters sentenced to death, to skiing over the Carpathian Mountains with invaluable microfilm, to even engineering the surrender of an entire German garrison. Christine's wartime service was full of tales of espionage to rival any novelist's imagination. Alongside these travels, which took her anywhere from Hungary to Egypt, were also romantic liaisons, full of additional drama and intrigue. With the end of the war and the communist takeover of Poland, Christine found herself metaphorically marooned in post-war Britain, leading her to take a scattering of jobs just to get by. While working as a stewardess in the employ of a British ocean liner company, she attracted the romantic obsessions of a man who fatally stabbed her in a hotel lobby in 1952. The tragic and dramatic end of her life, while commemorated by those who knew her best in the immediate aftermath, nonetheless meant that a fair and dispassionate telling of her story never really materialized in more recent decades. In 2012, the critically acclaimed British author Clare Mulley published a new biography of Christine entitled The Spy Who Loved: The Lives and Loves of Christine Granville. This modern retelling of Christine's story created a renewed interest in her heroic life and introduced a whole new generation to her, myself included. We were incredibly privileged that Mulley, fresh on the heels of the publication of a new book on wartime Polish resistance fighter Elżbieta Zawadzka, was able to sit down with us to discuss the life of the remarkable Christine Skarbek. I've no doubt that you will be as drawn in by our discussion of this wartime larger-than-life heroine as I was. So good morning, Miss Mulley, coming to us from merry old England. It's really a terrific pleasure to have you on today.
Hello, Mr. Matulevich. It's very nice to be here.
So, you're the author of The Spy Who Loved. It's the secrets and lives of Christine Granville. I first heard about this book, I think it was from the Kosciuszko Foundation newsletter. It was a book review. I've been interested in history and Polish history in particular my entire life, and I had never heard of Christine Skarbek, or Christine Granville as she was known in the UK. And so I went down to my local library and I picked up a copy of your book, and I think I burned through it in 2 or 3 days. It
Excellent.
was an absolutely fascinating story. And, so I'm just kind of wondering, what prompted you to first research Christine? How did you hear about her? What was the genesis of this work?
Well, this is my second book. I've got 5 books out now, so it came out a little while ago. And I had my first book was about an English woman who nobody's ever heard of over here either, Eglantine Jebb, but that was a First World War story. And at the end of it, I couldn't believe it because it actually won a prize. And I thought, oh my goodness, I must write another book immediately. And I knew I wanted to write about another woman's story because I do think there is this rich seam of untold or perhaps poorly told, romantically told women's stories. And I wanted to focus on women's achievements and their real contributions. Um, and I was interested in Polish politics and Polish history. I had studied Polish politics as part of my first degree, and I had taught English as a foreign language in Poland one summer in Bydgoszcz, and became very interested in the history of that country. I mean, it's just got this incredibly rich, dramatic, powerful, full of tragedy, but also full of liberation and agency as well. And it's an extraordinary story. And I think in Britain, when we tend to think about the Second World War and resistance in the war, we tend to think about France. We look west. And there is this incredible story of the largest underground state, this huge clandestine movement, massive contribution in the intelligence war, but of course in the war in all sorts of theatres like the Battle of Britain and Monte Cassino and Tobruk and so on. So I've thought it would be fascinating to find a woman and I just couldn't believe how many women's stories there were. I've just done another book on a Polish woman, Elżbieta Zawadzka. I don't know if you've heard of her, Zo,
Mhm.
which is another extraordinary story. But Krystyna Skarbek's story spoke to me because she was actually the first woman to serve Britain as a special agent, although she was Polish born. And she did actually serve the Polish resistance as well. She served both. But largely she worked for the British Crown throughout the war because that was the first place that she could serve, get a position to serve, get the funding and the backing and the organisation to serve the Allied war effort.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because I think Poles, we are always interested in how people come across our culture because in some ways, like you said, that you look at the theater of war, the narrative of war in World War II, and I mean, from here in the United States, it's even totally different. One of the things that I noticed, the very first line that you have in your book is you dedicate it to your parents, and the line is, "Who watched the sky turn red over London during the Blitz and have reached out for better international relations ever since." My own trips to Europe, it's the sense of the war there is totally different because that's where it happened. But you go to Poland and it is this kind of long history that was even after the war. Every major town you see a memorial to those who were murdered by the Nazis and then those who were murdered by the Soviets. And it really was. And in Bydgoszcz, you mentioned, I mean, there was a really a painful history there in particular. I have some family from that area. I've been there. So yeah, absolutely. I can imagine that studying in Poland would definitely have opened that. So that's really fascinating. Was there anything particular that surprised you when you were first doing your research into this time period in Polish history? Did you have misconceptions that may have been changed, or how did that kind of manifest?
Um, I didn't so much have misconceptions as in I hadn't really ever studied the history of Poland per se in the Second World War. It doesn't seem to be on the agenda so much over here, and I think it's really important that we change that, especially at the moment with the current war that is ongoing, the Russian aggression into Ukraine. I think to understand that conflict, to understand the responses that we need to have and that we automatically have, we need to actually go back into the history and see that there has been centuries of countries in that area being invaded. Poland itself was annexed into separate empires, part occupied, disappeared from the map of Europe for over 120 years. Not that long ago, it was only at the end of the First World War that Poland was replaced to the map of Europe. So to understand all this, I think that is something that we have forgotten the importance of over here. And I think the post-war story as well. My new book about Zo, her story continues after the war. One of the great ironies of her story is she was one of the first women to serve in the war. She served throughout the conflict. She's a hair's breadth of being caught by the Germans throughout the 6 years of war, but she's only ever arrested by the communist Polish government imposed by the Soviet regime after the war, and then she is sentenced to 10 years in prison. In Britain, we've just celebrated, the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. And here there are lots of memories of bunting and jam tarts and street parties and the King and Winston Churchill addressing the crowds in Trafalgar Square and so on. But in Poland, they didn't get peace and freedom. They got some degree of peace, but they were left with this Soviet-imposed communist regime, and that history went on, and that has consequences that are still felt today. So this is what I think is so important to remember. That, and also, I think when we think about women's service in the war, we think about their courage, which is absolutely right, and we think about their sacrifice. And of course, lots of women lost their lives in the fight, and we do need to pay tribute to that. But the other thing I think people tend to focus on is what they look like, their appearance. If they were pretty, if you ever see women in the films, they're always in a silk dress and they're looking terribly glamorous. And actually, to be very beautiful could be a real problem if you're serving in the clandestine resistance, because anything that makes your face more memorable is going to be a real problem for you. And I just think we forget that women can be very plain and very effective and courageous fighters for democracy and freedom, So I hope that my work also rebalances the view on the effectiveness and the achievements of the women who serve.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that, so if you kind of are looking up Krystyna Skarbek for the first time, you come across these two phrases a lot, where she's characterized as the Polish James Bond and Churchill's favorite spy. And, in reading about her in your book, she's kind of this very strong, independent woman. And I almost was wondering if you think those two labels are justified, or is this kind of doing her a disservice by characterizing her as these two, one fictional, of course, but these two sort of high-profile men?
Yeah, I mean, the one I have particular issue with is the James Bond one. I mean, being Churchill's favourite spy. Now, this is something he did say to his daughter after the war. His daughter, Sarah Oliver, was an actress, and she wanted to play Krystyna Skarbek in the film. There was a script that was written by one of the men who served alongside her, Bill Stanley Moss, although that's now been lost. And a journalist asked her why she wanted to play Krystyna Skarbek in particular. She said because 1941, she was his favourite spy. And that was when she had just, I mean, the important thing is the context, isn't it? She had just smuggled across borders microfilm evidence taken by the clandestine Polish resistance, the AK, the Home Army, filmed evidence of German preparations for Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler would betray his former ally Stalin and invade Soviet-held territory in Europe, thereby forcing Stalin to change sides in the war and join the Allies, which of course was massively important. It's one of those pivotal moments in the war because that opened up the Second Front, the Eastern Front, that collectively helped us to push Nazi Germany right back to Berlin. So this was a hugely important achievement, and I think it's more important that we remember the achievement than because of that Churchill called her his favourite spy. But in a sense, I mean, he did say that. It is important, so that's okay. But calling her female, quite often they say, oh, she's a real Bond girl. That's even worse, isn't it? I mean, she's not a Bond girl. She's much more James Bond. She is the one with agency. I mean, she's a special agent. If you take her agency away, in what way is she special? It's really important. And she's real. She's not a figment of Ian Fleming's imagination. She's not a male fantasy. She is a real woman. She served in 3 different theatres of the war. She's very highly honoured because she was incredibly successful. And I hope we get to talk about some of her other achievements as well in this podcast, because it is absolutely, it's almost unbelievable. It's phenomenal.
No, it's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, the story, the one of her skiing over the Carpathians alone defies sort of the expectations of human resilience. I mean, it really, that's what, like I said, was so fascinating. I read the book so quickly because it was such a page turner. All these different, she should have been killed multiple times, and yet she wasn't.
She skied over the mountains more than once as well. So she was, this was in the first theatre of the war in which she served. She was sent to, really, I mean, she made the first contact between the British and the fledgling then Polish resistance right at the start of the war. She was in place before the end of 1939. And she skied probably 4 times over the mountain, skied and climbed as the weather changed over the first couple of years. And what she was doing was bringing in money to give to the different parts of the resistance. She was bringing in coding references. She would bring back coding books. She would bring back microfilm, sometimes hidden inside her leather gloves, to give to the resistance. And some of that, I mean, the high grade material can be sensed by the fact that some of that was the first film evidence of Operation Barbarossa, or preparations for that war turning moment. But that was just the preface of her work, if you like. She actually served in 3 different theatres of the war.
What about Christine's legacy and some of her achievements? How would you kind of characterize that?
It's she really stands out. I mean, it's extraordinary. Not only did she serve in 3 different theatres of the war, but the outcomes from her service are clearly identifiable. So early on in the war, of course, she not only establishes the first contact between the British and the Polish resistance, she brings out the first microfilm showing filmed evidence of preparations for Operation Barbarossa. From that point on, she has to move. She knows then her name is up as a wanted person, and there are posters with her face in the stations in Warsaw and elsewhere in occupied Europe. So she moves on and she serves in Egypt and the Middle East. And out there, she also becomes one of the most highly trained female agents, and she's being prepared to be dropped back behind enemy lines in preparation for D-Day in France. So she's actually the only woman to be parachuted to France from North Africa. She lands, she immediately steps up into action. She joins a circuit essentially as a courier, but quickly undertakes further operations off her own back where she sees opportunities. She's really quick thinking, very independent minded, very important skills for a special agent in the field. So while she is up in the Alps between the French and Italian border, she makes contact between the Italian partisans and the French resistance, which is hugely important for shared operational duties in the run-up to D-Day in the south. And then while she's up in the mountains, she manages on her own to single-handedly secure the defection of an entire Nazi German garrison on a strategic pass in the Alps, the Col de l'Arche pass. Again, it's just an extraordinary story. She climbed up there only armed with a loud hailer, and she had a headscarf to tie her hair back, which when she unfolded was white and red, the colours of the Polish flag. And she'd realised that there were conscripted Polish troops forced to work at that garrison. And without, while hiding from the German heads of the garrison, she manages to convert their loyalties, and they agree, and they actually bring down any small arms they can to join the French resistance, and they disable the bigger arms left at the garrison, meaning it's completely vulnerable and they have to surrender. It's absolutely a fantastic achievement. And that's not it. She gets to the bottom of the mountain. She realizes the 3 of the men she's been serving with, one of whom is British, or 2 in fact, one's French, have been arrested and sentenced to death in the morning. She begs the French resistance circuit to do a rescue, but they refuse, I think rightly, because they couldn't risk the men, the guns and ammunition that she herself had helped to have the supply drops delivered to them in the night on special duties flights. So she decided to do it herself, and she cycled 20 miles to the prison. I can't do the whole story now, but it's remarkable. She identifies by singing a song the men know, and they sing a chorus out the window, so she knows where they're being held. And basically she marches in and demands to see the Gestapo officer in charge, and demands their release. And she terrifies the people at the prison until she effects a release, and all 3 men are saved. And these are just some of her achievements.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary story too. Well, I remember reading that about the surrender of the whole garrison. I mean, that was just, I can't imagine James Bond doing that, put it that way.
No, I can't imagine anyone doing it. I mean, the whole time you're thinking, God, this is actually in the files, and it's corroborated in various different places. So it's just fantastic to bring this story to light.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit about her identity and what kind of made her who she was. In kind of looking at her story, the sense that I get, how I would describe her, is so very much pre-war Poland. I mean, she was born from an aristocratic lineage that goes back centuries, and her father was sort of this somewhat of a roguish character at times, drinking, and had this very aristocratic upbringing. And she was also half Jewish,
Her mother was
uh,
Jewish. Her mother was
very
born
well
Jewish.
educated. And so, I mean, talk about maybe a little bit about how your sense of how her identity became to define who she was.
I do think it's very important. When she was born, Poland was still actually divided up into the three very aggressive neighbouring states. So she was actually um, uh, born, I think, in the Russian part of Poland, Russian-held part, and she was a countess. Although it's disputed, there is some controversy around whether her father really it was a legitimately held title. As you may know, the system in Poland is fairly complicated. Um, but she certainly grew up with this strong sense of her Polish heritage. Her father used to impress on his business and political contacts the importance of the Skarbek family by telling stories about how the Skarbeks had driven out centuries earlier previous German emperor who was invading Polish territory. And Skarbek herself was so proud of this story of her family heritage that she would tell it often to people that she met, including during the war. And she told it so often she was nearly identified as she's the woman who tells that story once. So you can see how important this was to her that she carried it with her. She grew up, they had a huge estate. She was used to a lot of freedom and wealth and also adoration. She was very attractive as a young girl. Her father adored her, but also she had this Jewish heritage. The money from the family actually came from her mother's banking family. Her mother had converted to Catholicism to marry her father, but she was perceived. I mean, Polish society, very much like British society, I'm very sad to say, was deeply anti-Semitic at that time, and she suffered from that. So actually, although she was used to a lot of adoration and freedom, she was also used to having to fight her corner in society. I think this all gave her a lot of skills of how to manipulate herself, how to have resolve, and how to carry in her heart these very strong feelings that gave her courage from within as well. So her identity is very important.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring up the dubious or possibly dubious title of count. Um, Especially in America, even though we're supposed to be this egalitarian nation, we love our Downton Abbey, we love our British royal family. We have this affection for titles, and what you bring up about Polish aristocracy being much more dynamic. I mean, if you had a title, it was from a foreign power. Polish nobles didn't have them, and it's also, as much as we kind of think of that, and even the title of the film that was produced, the documentary film produced by her, No Ordinary Countess, it kind of keeps to perpetuate this sense of Polish aristocracy that kind of betrays the whole story. But it's also a system that now, I mean, with communism, was essentially obliterated
Mm.
and very, very hard to associate with nowadays. So I think that's an interesting part of her story, is that so much of Polish history as we know it today is defined by the Second World War, but the years following the Second World War, as we talked about before, and how communism really it reoriented a whole system that produced her. So
Yeah,
it's just,
I
I-
mean,
and just, I mean, what was her sense of? I mean, she didn't live that long after the war, because of her
tragic
tragic
thing.
murder. But what was kind of her sense of that? I'm wondering too, about like how was, having been brought up in this pre-war, pre-Poland independence. How did she kind of feel about that?
Like so many Poles, I mean, she would have wished to fight on to see Polish freedom. She recognised that Poland didn't get freedom at the end of the war. It's one of the ironies of the war story, isn't it? That Britain went to war. The pretext given was to secure the freedom of their ally Poland, and Poland, among the first of the allies, ends the war with a Soviet-imposed communist regime. They don't have that democratic freedom, and of course, this was deeply wounding. Um, I mean, there's a massive conversation to be had there about the various treaties that were agreed, what was discussed at them, what the big three were doing, whether Poland was sold out, whether Britain and America actually had the resources at the end of the war, the political will to maintain the fight. from Krystyna's own perspective, I mean, she knew that she couldn't go back to a communist Poland. One of the things I found in the archives, actually, which was absolutely fascinating, was that towards the end of the war, the British had actually traded her name and the name of her one-legged lover, actually, Andrzej Kowerski, for the names of a couple of NKVD agents. So had she have gone back, she would have been picked up immediately. And in fact, her brother, who we don't know that much about, there's not that much in the historical record, but we know that he served in the Home Army, so that's the Polish resistance clandestine forces during the war. And after he survived the war, but after the war, he died in a communist cell of respiratory diseases, is what's given. So she would have been seen as a betrayer. She had served the British Crown, a capitalist. She wouldn't have survived had she gone back. And of course, the horror is that many thousands of leading Polish resistors were killed by that communist regime in the post-war years. So yes, I mean, that would have been deeply distressing for her. She knew she couldn't return to the country that she had in her heart laid down her life for 6 years, but she was able to stay in Britain. Britain's first mass immigration policy was actually the Polish Resettlement Act, which enabled many thousands of Poles. It's partly why we have such a large Polish community in Britain today, and Polish is Britain's second language, in fact. So she was one of those who was able to remain in Britain. But of course, she wasn't given the continued service worthy of her achievements. She was dismissed with £100. I mean, it's not that little. It was about 3 months' wages at the time, but it's not a significant amount to resettle your entire life. She ended up with various terrible jobs. Well, not terrible jobs, but just, before the war, she was a countess. She travelled to Britain to serve in the war, first class on a passenger ship from Southern Africa. She ends the war. One of the jobs she takes is cleaning toilets on a passenger ship going around the world. And I think this job gave her some sense of freedom. She was still able to travel. She was able to see the world, go to South Africa or New Zealand. But she is having to work her way. And ironically, the captain of the ship once asked all of his staff to put on any decorations they'd received in the war for an event they were having. And Christine had these incredible, I mean, a row of ribbons that any general would have been proud of. She had the Cross Croix de Guerre from France, she had the OBE, and she had the George Cross. It was this incredible amount of honours. And people just assumed that this, A, a woman, B, she had a slight accent. She clearly wasn't British born. And they just thought that she must be a fantasist or something. And she was pretty badly abused. So it's a truly tragic end for a woman who had put her life on the line so long and achieved so much for the Allied cause.
Yeah, that was a fascinating story too. So there are two previous podcasts we've done on here. We did one that was just on the history of Polish ocean liners.
Right.
So it was interesting that she had actually worked as a stewardess.
Bathroom stewardess, yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of that post-war history is fascinating to me of Poles in Britain. There was a film I had seen about the Polish airmen of the Polish squadron, and some of them you see at the very end they're working as taxi drivers and
returning Brits. There was massive demobilisation. The economy was on its knees. There weren't the jobs for the Brits either. So it was. I mean, it's so awful. When the Battle of Britain is going on, every girl wants to date a Polish Air Force officer. They've got these, they look great in their uniform. They'll bow and kiss your hand, and they're putting their life on the line. And the two squadrons that got the highest number of kills in the Battle of Britain were the two Polish squadrons, most famously 303, but also 302. And there were actually Polish bomber squadrons as well, which is often forgotten. So they were the great heroes. At the end of the war, very quickly, you have graffiti on city walls saying "Poles go home." No understanding what going home means if you're going back to that regime, which sees a lot of the returning officers immediately as enemies of the state. And lots of Poles, of course, did want to return because their families were there and they wanted to help rebuild their nation from the rubble that it was left at the end of the war. And a lot of them regretted that decision, but a lot of them did make their way and did help to develop their nation. So it's a very complicated story that she is caught up in there. And I think it's often forgotten, the post-war story.
Yeah, no, absolutely it is. And that sense of returning home was very strong for Poles. And it's kind of been interesting how, in successive generations that as Poles get more established in a country that's foreign, that starts to dissipate. But then it just was, there was always this kind of drawback to Poland. So, but they couldn't. You're absolutely right, because of, they would have been executed by the NKVD or who have you. So speaking about her, this actually brings me to one of my next questions. I'm curious about her legacy in the UK and Poland. I know you said that the Poles are the second largest. Did you say this is the second language in the UK? And there's the British Poles webpage, actually, which I follow, britishpoles.uk. And there was an article I'd read recently about how this new film that had just come out last month, we're recording this in October, about Krystyna Skarbek, kind of had met with a little bit of resistance, it seemed, in Poland. So I'm curious what your sense of her legacy in Poland and sort of in the UK is.
I haven't seen that film. They didn't option my book, so although they did tell me they used it, but I haven't had the opportunity. I actually just got back last night from a tour of Poland with my new book, Agent Zoe. So I can't comment on the film itself. But I do know that some of the Poles there, of course, were mentioning it and saying it's a shame. Apparently, a lot of the action is the work she undertook in France, and there isn't enough sense of her as a Polish woman and the service she undertook in Hungary and Poland earlier on in the war. But I haven't seen the film, as I said. But I think there is. I mean, she is. In Poland, she is perceived very much as having served the British rather than the Poles, because actually she was in Southern Africa at the start of the war. And by the time her passenger ship got back, Poland had fallen. I mean, Poland never capitulated. They got the majority of their armed forces, 350,000 troops out almost immediately through Lviv, which is now Lviv, of course, into France to regroup, served in France, served up in Britain, Scotland, and throughout Europe afterwards. So Poland never capitulated and continued the fight throughout the war. But by the time she reached Europe in late 1939, Poland had been occupied and divided up. And she felt the best or the fastest way she could get into the fight was to be taken on by the Brits at that point. And so that is what she did. She volunteered, or she demanded rather than volunteered, to be taken on by the British Special Forces, and they set her up in Hungary, in Budapest, and then she served, her first service was skiing over the mountains into occupied Poland to make that first contact. But she did also work for the ZWZ, which is an early Polish resistance body that became, or was burnished with other groups into the RKR later on. So she actually, in her heart and even officially on paper, was also serving the Polish resistance as well. But she was mainly employed by the Brits. And in Poland, she is seen as a woman who served the British interests rather than the Polish ones. I think that's very unfair, because she was serving both. Her medals are now kept in the Polish Institute and Musiccourtesy Museum in London. And they are all there on some very nice blue velvet. And with them, she keeps a Polish gorget, so a silver sort of lozenge that would have been worn around the neck. It's not an official Polish honour. She's never received a Polish honour. But the fact that she kept this Polish gorget with her British and French medals shows that, for her, that is what she is saying, is that she was fighting in her heart for Poland as well. And certainly she was serving Polish interests as well, particularly early on in the first part of the war. But I mean, you could say that the Polish forces fighting in Italy, for example, were they fighting for Poland? They're never sort of disinherited by Poland, because they were serving directly up the British Armed Forces line of command. So I think that there is a lot of sexism in here as well, that she is judged on being a woman, and that is separately and distinct to any of the service of the men who served via the Allied armed forces. So I think that's a tragedy. But I think she has become more embraced as her story has been better known. So since the book came out, one of the things I'm delighted about is the Polish club in London, Ognisko Polski, commissioned some years ago now a bronze bust of Krystyna Skarbek, so that is now held and can be seen if people go there. It's a beautiful building, and you can go in, and on Exhibition Road, opposite the British Museum for Natural History, just down on that street. And it's fantastic. And they've got a bar called the General's Bar, where they have big pictures of all the Polish generals behind the bar, serving all the alcohol that they would have drunk, all the lovely vodka they'd have drunk post-war. So it's wonderful that she is now getting that kind of recognition among the other Polish heroes.
Yeah, after you had mentioned the Polish club in your book. I was looking it up and added it to my list of places to go the next time I'm in London.
Yeah,
For
do go.
sure,
Do go.
there's a place of pilgrimage. But going back to to my point about her legacy in Poland, I almost wondered too if it was. It seems like Poles, we have this tendency to want to canonize our heroes or to make sure that they're just above reproach. And I wondered if, in addition to sexism, it might be this sort of, because of her different lovers and things like that, if she was kind of seen as this, if that had been a part of it or not too. It was kind of curiosity in my mind. But
The other lovers things, I mean, she did have a lot of lovers. That is part of her character and personality. In a sense, she was a woman ahead of her times in many ways, and this is one of them. The book is actually called The Spy Who Loved because she loved adventure and adrenaline, and perhaps it's ironic that it's war that we still tend to think of as primarily a masculine field that gave her that freedom, the chance to live a really active and useful life. So she loved adrenaline and her mission work. She loved men, of course. She had 2 husbands. She had many lovers. But above all, she was a woman who loved freedom and independence, both for the country of her birth, Poland, her adopted country, Britain. She became a British citizen after the war, but also for herself personally, her own freedom and independence to be the person, to be the woman that she wanted to, and lead the life, a very richly full life in every respect. And I think certainly straight after the war, there was discussion about having this film and discussion about having another book about her. And the group of men among whom she had served, many whose lives she had actually saved, got together and they created what they called the Panel to Protect the Reputation of Countess Skarbek. And that was about, they just felt that if it came out that she has so many lovers, that this would be a negative thing, and they wanted to protect her reputation. Now, I think they did this honourably. I think they really felt in the early 1950s perhaps this was something they should do for her. But having said that, many of them were married, many of them had been her lover, and perhaps there was more than one reputation at stake here. I think it's, if we think of a man in the war who thinks that he may die at any moment or might just have, 5 or 6 weeks to live at any point, you think you're going to seize life. Good for him, get some action. Great. When it's a woman, that is seen differently. So I think that is pure sexism, but I think hopefully we can step beyond that and accept her as she was. But I do think she's a woman with faults. I just don't think it's the sex is a fault. There are times, as her biographer, when I started out, I was like, oh my God, she is fantastic. But I think that doesn't help. When you want to write a biography, you do need to take a step back and be objective. And there are occasions when I got very irritated with her, and I found her decisions sometimes frustrating. But I would be absolutely disaster in a time of war. So I do recognise. I'm not trying to diss her. She is a complete hero, but she is human. This is not a hagiography, and I think that's really important that we do recognise faults and all. In Poland, yes, there is a real sense of patriotism and pride, and they've got an awful lot to be proud of. But I think it's also very important that history is messy. I think the most fascinating areas are the grey areas. There aren't any perfects. There's no moral absolutes, particularly in a time of war. Difficult decisions must be taken. And Krystyna Skarbek had to take some of those.
The Second World War seems to provide an endless stream of stories of unimaginable heroics and horrors. Within these stories, the temptation can be to find clear-cut black and white versions of people that conform to our notions of good and evil. This often has the unintended consequence of doing a disservice to the multifaceted sides of human beings that is the true character of all people, after all. I hope that you will agree that in the person of Krystyna Skarbek, we find a dramatic figure whose sense of patriotism and devotion to cause was as passionate as that which drove her personal relationships. Her story is one of remarkable achievements that cannot be summarized or justified by a pithy comparison to a person of fictional popular culture. Her legacy, which in part opens the way we seek to commemorate the heroics of women in times of war, as well as in our national memory, is one that I certainly hope you will take forward. In telling these stories on our program, cast so often in the lens of eternal memory and faith as has been our mission for over a century, we must tread lightly and ensure that we do not seek to conform the realities of a person to our expectations. If you'd like more information on Krystyna Skarbek, check out our social media pages this month, as well as links to Clare Mulley's book. Don't forget to follow, subscribe, link, and rate our show wherever you listen to our podcast, not only to help increase our visibility, but also so that you automatically get updates whenever we drop a new episode. You can always reach out to us at pierogietoprayer@gmail.com with any questions or feedback. We absolutely love to hear from you. And remember that you can always visit us every Sunday at 10 a.m. at St. Joseph's in Camden, as thousands have for over a century. Don't forget to listen to our following episode on our Polish Day of the Month, which will come out later this week. Until next time, sautej some pierogi and go sit with the saint. Dziękujemy, thank you, and do usłyszenia.